Billionaire adopted 6 homeless toddlers no one wanted. 20 years later, they came back and changed his life. He was 60 years old, sitting in a wheelchair and completely alone. The man who had everything had somehow ended up with nothing that mattered. 20 years ago, he made one decision that the whole world called crazy. 6 3-year-old girls that nobody wanted. 6 children that every system had given up on. He had no idea they were about to save him right back. There is a specific kind of loneliness that only visits people who have achieved everything they set out to achieve. It is quieter than ordinary loneliness. And it is much, much heavier. Edward Harlan had built an empire. He just hadn't noticed, somewhere along the way, that he'd forgotten to build a life inside it. "Sir, your 9 o'clock board call is in 10 minutes. Cancel it." A pause from the doorway. His assistant Marcus, young, efficient, perpetually slightly alarmed, shifted his weight. "Sir, this is the quarterly review," Mr. Donovan specifically said. Marcus. "Yes, sir." "Cancel it." Another pause. "Yes, sir." The door clicked shut. Edward Harlan sat in his wheelchair at the floor-to-ceiling window of his Chicago penthouse and looked at the city 22 floors below. It was early March. The lake was steel gray and restless. The streets were still carrying the last gray residue of winter. From up here, everything looked small and far away, which was, he had come to understand, the occupational hazard of spending your entire life building yourself higher and higher above everything else. He was 60 years old. His legs had stopped working reliably at 58, a degenerative condition that his team of very expensive doctors described with a lot of technical language that ultimately meant, this is only going one direction. He had accepted this with the same controlled efficiency he applied to everything, adapted, accommodated, kept moving in the new literal and limited sense of the word. What he had not adapted to, what no amount of efficiency or control could accommodate, was the silence. Harlan Group employed 4,000 people. Edward sat on the boards of 2 hospitals and a university. He had a personal assistant, a household staff of 6, a driver, a physical therapist who came 3 times a week, and a financial advisor who called so often Edward had started letting it go to voicemail. He had not had a real conversation, the kind where someone says something true and the other person says something true back, in longer than he could honestly remember. His wife Diana had died 11 years ago, quietly, in a hospital room that cost more per night than most people's monthly rent, which hadn't made it any less devastating or any less lonely. They had not been able to have children. This had been the great, quiet grief of their marriage, not loud, not dramatic, just always there, like a chair at the table that was always set and never occupied. Except for 6 years. Edward reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a photograph. Old now, worn at the edges, colors slightly faded the way photographs fade when they've been handled many times over many years. He looked at it the way he looked at it every morning. 6 little girls, 3 years old, each of them, sitting in a line on the front steps of a house that no longer existed, his and Diana's house in Evanston, the one they'd sold after she got sick. 6 small faces looking at the camera with varying degrees of cooperation, one grinning wildly, one completely solemn, one mid-sneeze, one trying to get off the step, one waving at something off-camera, and one, the smallest one, looking directly at the lens with enormous dark eyes and an expression of ancient, patient calm. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he put it back in his pocket. "Marcus," he called. The door opened immediately. Marcus had clearly not gone far. "Sir, I want you to find them," Edward said. A pause. "Sir, my daughters." He turned his wheelchair from the window. "All 6 of them. I want to know where they are, what they're doing, if they're all right." He looked at Marcus directly. "Can you do that?" Marcus straightened. "Yes, sir. Of course. Don't contact them. Don't tell them. Just find them." "Understood." After Marcus left, Edward sat in the quiet penthouse and let himself go back. 20 years. 20 years since the decision that his entire board, his lawyers, his financial advisors, his friends, every single person whose opinion he had solicited, and several whose opinions he hadn't, had called the most reckless thing Edward Harlan had ever done. 6 children, Edward. 3 years old. All at once. You're not equipped for this. Diana's condition is uncertain. This is the wrong time. You don't know anything about raising children. 1 would be a challenge. 6 is, Edward, 6 is impossible. He had listened to all of it. He had nodded at all of it. And then he had signed the papers anyway. It had started with one phone call from a social worker named Patricia Chun, who had his number because he'd funded a foster care initiative 3 years prior. She'd called on a Tuesday in February, cold, gray, the kind of day that makes Chicago feel like a punishment. Mr. Harlan, I have a situation, and I'm running out of options, and someone told me you sometimes do unexpected things. That's one way to put it, he'd said. I have 6 little girls. 3 years old, all of them. They came in together from a group home that was shut down. We've been trying to place them for 4 months. Nobody will take all 6. We keep offering to split them up and… A pause. They won't split. Every time we try, they hold on to each other. They won't let go. They've been together since they were infants and they're… Another pause, and he could hear something in Patricia Chen's voice that professionals in that field work very hard to keep out of their voice. They're 3 years old, and they already know that the world is a place that tries to separate you from the people you love. Edward had been quiet for a moment. What are their names? He asked. Patricia had told him. He had written them down. He had looked at the list for a long time. Then he had said, "Tell me what I need to do." Diana had cried when he told her. Not from upset, from something else. Relief, maybe. Or recognition. The feeling of a door opening that you had quietly, privately stopped believing would ever open. They had turned the Evanston house upside down. 6 small bedrooms. 6 small beds. 6 sets of everything, shoes, coats, cups, toothbrushes in 6 different colors. A housekeeper who had raised 4 children of her own and looked at the chaos with professional serenity. A rotating team of support. And 6 3-year-old girls who arrived on a Wednesday afternoon holding hands in a chain, the smallest one at the end, all of them looking at this big house and this man in his expensive coat with the careful eyes of children who had learned not to trust good things too quickly. The smallest one, the one with the enormous dark eyes, had looked at Edward for a long moment. Then she had let go of the chain, walked up to him, and put her hand in his. Just like that. No reason. No history. Just trust, offered plainly, the way children offer it before the world teaches them not to. Edward had looked down at that small hand in his and felt something rearrange permanently inside his chest. "Hi," she had said. "Hi," he had said back. Her name was Maya. 6 children becomes 6 people. That's the thing about raising someone. You never know what you're growing until it's grown. And sometimes what grows is so much more than you planted. Marcus came back with a file. Edward sat in his wheelchair and read it and felt 20 years collapse into a single breath. "You found all 6. Edward said. Marcus set the folder on the table beside Edward's wheelchair. It was thick. "All 6, sir. It took 4 days. 2 of them weren't easy." "Which 2? "Lily and Maya." Edward's hand stilled on the folder. "Maya, of course. Are they all right?" "Yes, sir." "There." Marcus paused, and for the first time in 3 years of working for Edward Harlan, he smiled with something genuine. "You should read it yourself." Edward opened the folder. Grace, 23. The folder had a photograph, a young woman with serious eyes and a stethoscope around her neck, standing outside what was clearly a hospital. Grace had been the solemn one. 3 years old, and already carrying herself like someone with places to be. She had spent her childhood reading every medical book in Edward's library with the focused intensity of someone with a plan. She was a resident physician at Northwestern Memorial. Pediatrics. Edward read that twice. Lily, 23. No stethoscope. The photograph was taken outside, mountains in the background, gear on her back. Lily had been the one mid-sneeze in the original photograph. She had also been the wildest. The one climbing things she shouldn't climb. The one who once disappeared for 2 hours and was found at the top of the oak tree in the backyard, completely unbothered. She was a wilderness rescue coordinator in Colorado. She trained teams that went into the mountains when other options ran out. Edward sat with that for a moment. Of course she did, he thought. Sophie, 23. Sophie had been the one trying to get off the step. She had also been, from age 4 onward, constitutionally incapable of sitting still and possessed of an overwhelming need to fix things. Toys, furniture, the kitchen sink at age 7, which had resulted in a memorable flood. She was a structural engineer. She'd been part of the team that redesigned the drainage infrastructure for a major Houston neighborhood after flooding destroyed it. She was fixing things at scale. Edward wasn't remotely surprised. Claire, 23. Claire had been the one waving at something off-camera in the photograph. As it turned out, she had always been waving at something off-camera, always ahead of where everyone else was looking, always turning toward the next thing. She had spent her teenage years writing, filling notebook after notebook with words that spilled out of her faster than she could organize them. She was a journalist. Investigative. Based in Washington, D.C. She had recently published a piece on child welfare system failures that had been cited in 2 congressional hearings. The child welfare system. The same system that had produced her. Edward closed his eyes for a moment. Ruby, 23. Ruby had been the grinning one. Always. From the moment she arrived in that chain of 6 small hands, Ruby had grinned at the world like it was a party she was delighted to have been invited to. She had also cried the loudest and laughed the loudest and fought with her sisters the loudest and made up with them the loudest. She ran a nonprofit in Atlanta. Arts programs for foster children. The program served 300 kids a year. Ruby was apparently the kind of person who walked into rooms and immediately made them larger. Edward looked at her photograph. She was laughing mid-motion, the same grin she'd had at 3, and felt something in his chest that he recognized after a moment as pride so large it had nowhere to go. Maya, 23. The last file. The smallest one. The one who had let go of the chain and walked up to him and put her hand in his without being asked. The photograph was not a professional one. It was clearly taken by someone else, candid outside. Maya was sitting on the steps of what looked like a community center, talking to a group of teenagers who were listening with the focused attention that young people only give to someone they actually trust. She was a youth counselor and community advocate on the south side of Chicago. She was 20 minutes away from this penthouse. She had been 20 minutes away, and he hadn't known. Marcus had said she wasn't easy to find. The note in the file explained Maya had legally changed her last name at 18. Not to something random. To Harlan. She had kept his name. Edward put the folder down on his lap. He sat in the quiet of his penthouse for a long time. These were his daughters. Not biologically, not in any way that a legal document couldn't also describe, but his. He had held their hands through nightmares and homework and first days of school and broken bones and broken hearts. He had watched Diana love them with everything she had for the 6 years they had together before she got sick. He had continued alone after that, imperfectly, inadequately, with the help of Mrs. Garcia and Marcus's predecessor and a rotating cast of tutors and coaches and therapists who had filled the gaps his own emotional limitations created. They had left for college. One by one, then in a cluster. His house in Evanston had emptied over 18 months. He had told himself it was right, that this was success, this was the point. You raise them to leave, you raise them to be exactly this, capable and independent, and out in the world making it better. He had told himself this was enough. He had been lying. Marcus, he said. Sir. I think, he stopped. Tried again. I think I made a mistake. After Diana died. I think I pulled back, and I told myself it was to give them space, but I think, he stopped again. This was not language that came easily to him. I think I was afraid. Marcus said nothing, which was the correct thing to say. I want to reach out to them, Edward said. I don't know if they'll respond. I don't know if they should respond. But I want to try. Do you want me to send a message, sir? No, Edward said. I want to do it myself. He sat up straighter in the wheelchair. Get me a pen, he said. I'm going to write 6 letters. He wrote the letters by hand, 4 pages each. He hadn't written anything by hand in 15 years. His fingers ached, his handwriting was worse than he remembered, and he didn't stop until all 6 were done. He mailed them on a Thursday. He told himself he was prepared for silence. He was completely wrong. I don't know if you remember. He crossed that out. They remembered. Of course they remembered. I don't know if you want to hear from me. He crossed that out too. Cowardly phrasing. Hiding behind their potential rejection to avoid his own accountability. He started again. I was not a perfect father. I want to start there because if I start anywhere else, everything after it is dishonest. When your mother died, I failed you. Not all at once, gradually, which is somehow worse. I withdrew. I told myself you were teenagers, then young adults, and you needed independence, not an aging man in declining health hovering over your lives. I told myself stepping back was an act of respect. I have had 11 years to sit with that decision. I don't believe it anymore. I stepped back because grief made me afraid, and I was not brave enough to tell you that. I should have been. You 6 were braver at 3 years old than I have been at 60. I am not writing to ask for anything. I am writing because you deserve to know that there has not been a single day in 20 years when I did not think about you. When I was not proud of you, even when I didn't know specifically what you were doing, I was proud of who I knew you were becoming because I knew who you were when you arrived and what you were made of. You were made of something extraordinary. All 6 of you. I cannot take credit for that, but I am grateful I was in the room when it grew. I am sorry for the distance. It was mine. It was never about you, Dad. He wrote 6 versions. Same truth, different details for each of them. A specific memory, a specific thing he had seen in each girl that he'd never said out loud. Grace's quiet ferocity with a medical textbook at age 7. Lily's fearlessness that had terrified him and awed him in equal measure. Sophie's hands, always taking something apart and putting it back together better. Claire's notebooks, the way she looked at the world like it was always telling her something worth writing down. Ruby's laugh, which had the structural property of making any room it entered impossible to be fully sat in. Maya's hand in his on the first day, offered freely, which had been the moment everything changed. He mailed all 6 on Thursday morning. He told Marcus he was not to be disturbed on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, because he intended to simply exist quietly with whatever came next. What came next arrived on Saturday afternoon. Not a letter, not an email, not a phone call, a knock. Marcus appeared in the doorway with an expression Edward had never seen on him before, a kind of stunned, almost reverent confusion. Sir, there are 6 women at the front desk. They say, he stopped, collected himself. They say they're your daughters. Edward went completely still. All 6. All 6, sir. They arrived together. A pause. Apparently, they all called each other after receiving the letters. They drove here from. Grace flew from Evanston. Lily flew from Denver last night. Sophie drove from. Sir. They organized themselves. They planned this. Marcus looked at him with something close to wonder. They've been planning it since yesterday morning. Edward looked at his hands. His heart was doing something that his cardiologist would probably want to know about. Tell them, he stopped. Sir? Tell them to come up, he said. Please. He heard them before he saw them, the elevator opening, voices overlapping, the specific sound of 6 people who had been raised together moving through space together, which has its own rhythm, its own frequency, unmistakable once you've known it. And then they were in the doorway. 23 years old. All of them. Grown into themselves completely, strangers in some technical sense, people he had not seen in years, and yet so immediately, So completely, so devastatingly familiar that Edward Harlan, who had not cried publicly since Diana's funeral, had to look at the ceiling for a moment. Ruby saw this immediately. Oh no, he's going to cry. Dad, don't cry, or I'll cry, and then all of us will cry, and this will be a whole thing. I'm not crying, Edward said, still looking at the ceiling. You absolutely are, Grace said, in her doctor voice that apparently started at age 7 and never stopped. He's definitely crying, Lily confirmed cheerfully. Maya walked across the room. She was the smallest one still. That hadn't changed. She walked across the room, and she did exactly what she had done 20 years ago on the front step of the Evanston house. She put her hand in his.
Just like that.
No preamble.
Hi, Dad, she said.
He looked at her. At this person who had kept his name. Who had been 20 minutes away.
Hi, he said.
His voice was completely gone. We got your letters, she said. I see that. We have some things to say back. He looked at all 6 of them standing in his penthouse. These extraordinary people, these women who had been 3 years old and frightened and holding hands in a chain, and who were now 23 and standing in his doorway like they'd never left, like no time had passed, like they had simply been somewhere else for a while and had now come home. I have time, he said. Good, Ruby said, already moving toward the couch. Because some of us have been saving things up for years, and I personally have a list. There are conversations that take 20 years to become possible. Not because the people aren't ready, but because the distance has to be crossed first. And crossing distance takes courage on both sides. 6 young women had crossed a continent in 24 hours. Edward owed them the same. They arranged themselves in his living room the way they always had, naturally, without discussion, the specific geometry of 6 people who had grown up sharing space. Ruby and Lily immediately occupied the largest couch. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor without explanation. Grace took the armchair nearest the window. Claire had already produced a small notebook from her bag, of course, and Maya sat beside Edward's wheelchair on a footstool, close enough that their proximity was clearly intentional. Who starts? Lily said. Claire should start, Grace said. She's been writing her speech in the car. It's not a speech, Claire said, flipping her notebook open. It's notes. There's a difference. What's the difference? Ruby said. A speech is for an audience. Notes are for accuracy. We are an audience, Sophie pointed out. I'll go, Maya said quietly. Everyone settled. Maya looked at Edward. She had a directness about her that had always been there. Even at 3, even in the uncertainty of a new house and new people, she had looked at things straight on. I'm not angry, she said. I want to start with that because I think you're expecting anger, and I don't want you spending this whole conversation braced for something that isn't coming. A pause. From me, anyway. I have some anger, Ruby said helpfully. Ruby, it's not bad anger. It's the productive kind. Maya continued. After Mom died, after Diana died, I know you pulled back. We all know that. We talked about it a lot over the years, the 6 of us. She glanced around at her sisters. And what we decided, what we came to, is that you were grieving. And you didn't know how to grieve and also be present at the same time. And instead of telling us that, you went quiet. She looked back at him. That hurt. I want you to know it hurt. Not because you grieved, that was right, she deserved to be grieved, but because you went quiet without explaining why, and we were 17 and 18 years old, and we thought we'd done something. Edward closed his eyes briefly. You hadn't. We know that now, Maya said. We didn't know it then. Silence. I'm sorry, Edward said. Not a performance. Not managed. Just the plain fact of it, said directly. We know, Maya said. Your letter said it, and we believed you. She paused. That's why we're here. They talked for 4 hours. Not all of it was gentle. Ruby's productive anger showed up around hour 2. Not explosive, but honest. She talked about the years after Diana died when she had performed happiness because she thought it was her job to make everyone feel better, including Edward, including her sisters, and how exhausting it had been, and how she'd eventually had to completely dismantle that pattern in her 20s and rebuild something more honest. "I used to call you," she said. "In college. I'd dial and then hang up, like 20 times. Ruby, I'm not telling you to make you feel bad. I'm telling you because you should know. I wanted to call. I just didn't think you. I didn't know if you wanted to hear from me. If I was a reminder of something painful. You were never. I know that now, too." She looked at him steadily. Her grin was still there. It was always there, but underneath it, he could see the real person it had sometimes covered. "We wasted some time, Dad. I just want us to both say that out loud, so we don't waste more." "Agreed," he said. Grace talked about medical school, the years of it, the cost of it, and the quiet way she'd handled the cost because she hadn't wanted to ask him and hadn't known if the door was open. She'd taken loans she didn't need to take. "You could have called me," he said. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "Could I have?" He understood. He had made it clear that the door was open. He'd assumed they knew. He'd assumed a lot of things that required him to never be the one to reach across the distance. Sophie talked about the first major project she'd ever led, a bridge reinforcement in her second year, her first real test. How she'd wanted to call him. How she'd sat with her phone for an hour. "I put your number in my phone as Dad from the day I got my first phone," she said matter-of-factly. "I never changed it, even when I didn't call." Claire didn't read from her notebook. She'd closed it halfway through Maya's opening and hadn't opened it again. What she said instead was this: "I wrote about the foster system because of us, because of what we came from. And every time I write one of those pieces, every single time, I think about the day Patricia Chin called you. I've thought about that call my whole life. What would have happened if she'd called someone else? Or if you'd said no?" She looked at him. "I don't know if we ever said thank you. Properly. For saying yes." Edward looked around the room. At all 6 of them. "You don't thank someone for," he started. "Yes, you do," Claire said simply.
Yes.
"You do." Maya was last. After the others had said what they'd come to say, after the room had gone through something difficult and come out somewhere cleaner on the other side, Maya sat on her footstool beside his wheelchair and said, "I want to tell you something I've never told anyone." "Okay." "The day we arrived at the house. The first day." She paused. "I was the one who decided. I told the others they were scared, all of them. I was scared too, and I said, I think it's okay. I think he's safe. And I walked up, and I put my hand in yours." She looked at him. "I was 3. I had no way of knowing that. I just knew. Maya. I just want you to know that I was right," she said quietly. "Even with the hard years. Even with the distance. I was right." A pause. "You were safe. You were the safest place we ever had." Edward Harlan pressed his hand over his mouth. This time, he didn't look at the ceiling. "Oh, he's definitely crying now," Ruby said softly. "We all are," Sophie said, equally softly. She was right. He had spent 2 years in the wheelchair telling himself the view from stillness was enough. He had been making do. There's a profound difference between making do and actually living, and sometimes it takes 6 people who love you to show you which one you've been doing. The daughters came back. And they did not leave. It started small. Maya came for dinner the following Tuesday. She brought food from a South Side restaurant she loved, said she wanted him to try something that didn't come from his building's in-house chef, which she delivered with exactly the amount of gentle irreverence that had always been her signature. They ate at the kitchen table. Not the formal dining room. The kitchen table, which Edward had not sat at in approximately 2 years because it required navigating the chair through a doorway that was slightly narrower than the others, and he had simply stopped bothering. Maya had noticed. She'd said nothing. She'd just set the table in the kitchen and waited. He'd navigated the doorway. "This is better," she said, looking around the kitchen. "What is?"
"This."
"The kitchen. You should eat here more." "It's impractical, Dad." She looked at him. "It's a slightly narrow doorway. It's not impractical. It's just harder. There's a difference.
He sat with that.
You sound like your mother, he said. She smiled, slow, genuine.
Good, she said.
Grace called every Sunday. Not obligation. She specified this the first time. I'm going to call you on Sundays because I want to, not because I think I should. So don't answer if you're busy and don't apologize for being busy. She called every Sunday. He answered every time. She talked about her patients, anonymized, careful, the way doctors learn to talk about the people they carry home with them. He listened. He asked questions. He had always been a good listener when he remembered to stop trying to also be a solution provider, and Grace would tell him crisply when he was doing the latter. I'm not asking you to fix it, Dad. I'm just telling you. He was learning. Sophie came in April with a specific purpose. She wanted to assess the penthouse. Assess it for what? Edward said. Accessibility. You've adapted around the limitations instead of adapting the space. That's backwards. She was already walking the perimeter with the eye of someone who makes things structurally sound for a living. The kitchen doorway is 3 inches too narrow. The bathroom door opens the wrong way. The desk in your office requires you to park at an angle that. Sophie. Yes. This apartment costs. I know what it costs. I also know what a 3-inch modification costs, which is significantly less. She turned and looked at him with the calm certainty of a structural engineer who has assessed larger problems than this. Will you let me do this? He looked at his daughter, this woman who had been taking things apart and putting them back better since she was 4 years old, and felt the specific surrender of a proud person recognizing that pride is sometimes just fear in a more respectable outfit. Yes, he said. She was done in 6 weeks. The changes were precise and clean and made every room in the apartment significantly more navigable. He didn't say thank you dramatically. He didn't make a speech. He just moved through the kitchen doorway without thinking about it one morning and registered the absence of effort and sat quietly with the gift of it. Lily video called from Colorado, which meant she was usually outside when she called, hiking at a training site, occasionally at a summit with terrible signal that kept cutting out. She talked fast and moved while she talked and made him feel, by proximity, that he was somewhere with air and space and altitude. How's the physical therapy? She asked one morning, hanging off what appeared to be offense. Consistent, he said. Are you doing the exercises between sessions? Lily. Dad. Most of them. Which ones are you skipping? The ones that are harder. A pause. Yes. Okay. Send me the sheet. I'll go through them with you on the call on Thursday. You don't have to. I train rescue teams, Lily said, with the easy authority of someone who has never once believed a limitation was permanent. I'm genuinely very good at this. Let me be useful. He sent her the sheet. She went through every exercise with him on Thursday with the precision of a professional and the irreverence of someone who had once climbed his oak tree at age 5 and laughed when he panicked from below. His physical therapist at the next session said his range of motion had measurably improved. He did not tell her why. He told Lily. Ruby came in May for what she called an unofficial visit and what turned out to be a complete renovation of the social calendar of one Edward Harlan. You don't go anywhere, she said, looking at his schedule with the expression of a nonprofit director identifying an organizational failure. I have board meetings. That's not what I said. I said you don't go anywhere. You go to meetings. That's different. She closed the calendar. I'm taking you somewhere on Saturday. Ruby. It's not negotiable. Put it in the calendar, Marcus. She called toward the door. Already done, sir. Marcus called back. Did you just recruit my assistant? He recruited himself. He seems very relieved that someone is doing this. She took him to a gallery opening. One of her artists, a 19-year-old from the South Side who had been through the foster system and who painted with an urgency that stopped people in front of the canvases and kept them there. Edward sat in the gallery in his wheelchair and looked at the paintings and talked to the artist for 45 minutes and felt, For the first time in years, the specific electricity of encountering someone else's work and being moved by it. On the way home, he was quiet.
You needed that, Ruby said.
Not I told you so. Just fact. Yes, he said. You've been in that building too much. Yes. We're going to fix that. Are we? She grinned. The same grin, unchanged by a single day. We've fixed harder things. Claire published a piece in June. It ran nationally. It was about the child welfare system, specifically the gap between the children who were placed and the children who were never placed, the ones who aged out of the system without ever having anyone say yes the way Edward Harlan had said yes 20 years ago. She didn't name him. She called him a businessman in Chicago who made a decision that nobody in his life supported, and that 6 people are alive differently because of. He read it 3 times. He called her. It's a good piece, he said. Thank you, Claire.
A pause.
I want to fund it. The issue. Not for credit, anonymously, or through the foundation, or however you think is right. But I have resources that should be doing this and they're not, and you clearly know exactly where they should go. A silence on the other end.
Are you sure? She said.
Your research identified the gaps. Sophie can help with the infrastructure. Ruby knows the community organizations. Grace knows the medical needs. Lily knows crisis response.
He paused.
And Maya knows the South Side better than anyone in my circle. Another pause. I have 6 experts in my family. I've been underutilizing them. That ends now. Another silence. Then Claire said, very quietly, Dad, that might be the best thing you've ever said. He had spent 40 years building things that bore his name. Towers. Companies. A legacy on paper. In the end, the only things worth building were the ones that breathed. The ones that called on Sundays. The ones that showed up at the front desk. All 6 of them. 24 hours after receiving a letter. This is the chapter where Edward Harlan finally understood what he had actually built, and it was so much greater than anything with his name on the door. The foundation launched in September. They called it the Open Door Initiative. Maya had suggested it and nobody argued because it was exactly right. The name referred to the moment Edward had opened his door 20 years ago, and to every door they intended to open for children that the system had passed by. The logo was simple, a door, slightly ajar, light coming through. Claire handled the strategy and communications. Ruby built the community partnerships. Sophie designed the physical spaces, drop-in centers, modified for accessibility, built right. Grace sat on the medical advisory board and wrote the health intake protocols. Lily designed the crisis response, training for the staff. Maya led the South Side pilot program, which served 47 children in its first 2 months. Edward sat on the board. He listened more than he spoke, a new skill, hard one. He wrote the checks and asked the questions and got out of the way of 6 people who were considerably better at the actual work than he was. It was the most useful he had felt in a decade. The first major event was in October. A fundraising dinner. Ruby's idea, executed with her particular combination of warmth and organizational precision. The venue was a hotel ballroom. 300 guests. The 6 daughters were all there, all in the same room for the first time in years, and the specific energy of that, of all 6 of them together, filled the room with something that people kept commenting on without being able to name it. Edward sat at the head table in his wheelchair and watched his daughters work the room. Grace, talking to a hospital administrator with the focused intensity of someone who has already identified exactly what she needs from this conversation. Lily, somehow making a group of corporate donors look like they were genuinely having fun. Sophie, in deep conversation with an architect about the second location's design. She had a napkin out and was already sketching. Claire, recorder out, asking a former foster youth questions that were making him cry in the best possible way. Ruby on the stage now, speaking without notes, making 300 people laugh and then making them very quiet with the kind of storytelling that costs something real to deliver. And Maya, beside Edward's wheelchair. She had been there all evening, not hovering, just present. Close enough. You did this, Maya said quietly, watching her sisters. No, Edward said. You did this. All 6 of you. We didn't do it alone. Neither did I. After the event, after the guests had gone and the staff was clearing the room, the 7 of them, Edward and his 6 daughters, sat at the emptied head table and did nothing for a while. Just sat. The way people sit when they are comfortable enough with each other to not need to fill the space. Grace has something to say, Sophie said eventually. I do not. You've been composing it in your head all evening. I can tell. Grace gave Sophie the look of a person who is deeply annoyed at being correctly read. Then she set her hands flat on the table in the manner of a doctor delivering information. We want to propose something, she said. We voted, Lily added. It was unanimous. What was unanimous? Edward said. We think you should move, Grace said. From the penthouse. It's too much space for one person and the building isn't well suited for your needs, and… Sophie could build you something, Ruby said. She's been sketching it for months. Show him, sophomore. Sophie, who had absolutely been sketching it for months and had not mentioned this fact, produced a folded set of papers from her bag with the air of someone who had simply been waiting to be asked. She unfolded them on the table. Architectural sketches. A house, single story, clean lines, smart design. Every space thoughtfully proportioned. A generous office. A room marked guest. Any/all. A garden. Where? Edward said. Evanston, Maya said. He looked up at her. Near where the old house was, she said. Not the same street, but the same neighborhood. She met his eyes. We all know that neighborhood. We all know how to get there. He looked at the sketches for a long time. This is what you voted on? That, Claire said, and the fact that we'd like to establish a standing Sunday dinner. Rotating houses. When we're in the city. I'm not always in the city, Lily said. You can video call in, Ruby said. Like you do for everything. I object to the characterization that I video call for everything. Lily.
Fine.
Yes. I'll video call. Edward looked around the table. At these 6 people, 23 years old, his daughters in every way that mattered, grown into exactly themselves, out in the world doing work that was real and necessary and good. He looked at Sophie's sketches. He looked at Maya beside him. He thought about a Tuesday in February, 20 years ago. A phone call from a social worker. 6 names written on a piece of paper. A decision that everyone told him was impossible. He thought about the front step of the Evanston house. A chain of 6 small hands. The smallest one letting go. You know, he said, when Patricia Chin called me, the social worker, the one who called about all of you, she said you wouldn't split up. She said every time they tried, you held onto each other. They were quiet. She made it sound like a problem, he said. Like it would make everything harder. He looked around the table. It was the first thing I knew I loved about you. Before I'd even met you. You loved that we were difficult? Ruby said. I loved that you knew what mattered and you held on to it, he said. Even at 3 years old. Even with nothing. You knew what mattered. A silence settled over the table. The good kind, the kind that holds something rather than avoiding it. Well, Maya said softly, we learned from the best. The house in Evanston was finished the following spring. The first Sunday dinner was in April. All 6 were there, even Lily, who had moved a project timeline specifically, which she denied when asked. Mrs. Garcia, their old housekeeper who was 72 and retired and had driven herself from Oak Park because nobody had the nerve to tell her not to, commanded the kitchen with unchanged authority. Edward sat at the head of the table. Around it, 6 women, 23 years old, all talking at once in the overlapping way of people who grew up sharing every table, every conversation, every quiet and every noise. Ruby was telling a story that required both hands. Grace was correcting a factual error in the story, with evidence. Lily was disagreeing with the correction. Sophie was eating and watching the argument with quiet amusement. Claire had her notebook and was writing something down. Maya was beside Edward, close enough that their proximity was clearly intentional, same as it had always been. He sat at the head of the table, 60 years old, in his wheelchair, in this house that his daughter had designed, and looked at the life around him. He had spent 40 years building things, towers and companies, and a legacy on paper. He had done it with ferocious skill and significant cost, and it had produced, in the end, a penthouse on the 22nd floor where a man could sit very high above everything and feel very alone. And then, 20 years ago, he had made one decision that everyone called impossible. He looked at the table. At these 6 extraordinary people who had been 3 years old and frightened and holding hands and who were now here, around this table, in this house, arguing about Ruby's story and filling the room with the kind of noise that is the opposite of silence. He had not built this. This had grown in spite of every mistake, every distance, every year he'd gotten wrong. This had held on the same way they'd held on to each other on that front step, because it was real, and real things hold when you give them even half a chance. "Dad," Lily said mid-argument, "adjudicate this. Did the shark in Ruby's story get bigger each time she told it, or was it always that big?" "It was always that big. Biologically impossible. I have a witness." Sophia was 3. Edward looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at his daughters, all 6 of them, turned toward him, waiting. "It was always exactly that big," he said. Ruby pointed at Grace in triumph. Grace closed her eyes in the manner of a person who has decided this battle is not worth the energy. Lily looked personally betrayed. Sophie smiled at her plate. Maya put her hand on his arm. The same hand, the same gesture, 20 years unchanged. And Edward Harlan laughed. A real one. The kind that starts deep and fills the room. It turned out the room had been waiting for it. He had given them a home. They had given him back his life. And the only one who had known, from the very first moment, that it would turn out exactly this way, was a 3-year-old girl who let go of a chain of hands and walked across a porch and said,
"Hi."
Like it was already decided. Because it was. But this is only where the story begins. What happens next will change everything. Secrets will be revealed. Lives will be shattered. And love will be tested in ways you never saw coming. If you want to see part 2, here's all you have to do. Backhand index pointing right, like this video. It tells us you want more backhand index pointing right. Subscribe and hit the bell. So part 2 finds you the moment it drops backhand index pointing right. Comment part 2 below, so we know you're ready. Every like, every comment, every subscribe tells us keep going. Keep telling these stories.